Good morning.
Good morning.
As Brad and I plan together and pray together and consider our times of worship, we tend to look ahead. And actually, we know this is the early part of summer, but we're kind of already looking towards fall. Haven't quite talked about Christmas yet, but we kind of think ahead. And so we had decided early on, and I knew early on I was going to be doing this talk on Sabbath. But what I didn't know at the time was how busy my life was going to be. And what I didn't know at the time was, my dad would be sick. He's still in the hospital. It's been over 30 days, and that puts a strain physically and emotionally and spiritually. And so this week, God and I had some talks. Actually, I did a lot of talking there for a while. I said, really, God? Really? Really? This was the plan for me to talk about Sabbath? And so I thought about, well, maybe I should talk about something other than rest, something that would be a lot more comfortable for me. God wanted to talk to me this morning. So, as we're exploring this topic together, know that we're in the journey together. Amen? We're all in this together. And it's something that I really believe God is wanting to speak into our hearts. Because when I look around, I'm not sure what has happened. Have you ever had that feeling? We live in a world that seems to be addicted to speed and fastness. Everything's open 24 hours anymore, and everyone is trying and working and busy, and we're frazzled, and we're stressed, and we're burned out, and we're exhausted, and we wish things were different. When I was back in seminary, there was a book that we read by Dr. Archibald Hart at the time, and it was titled a book, Adrenaline and Stress. So that was 20 years ago that God started speaking to my heart about this, because in his book, Adrenaline and Stress, he talks about what happens physically when you continue to live your life in adrenaline and what that does physically to your body. Now, the reason they had us pastors read it was because every Sunday morning when we stand up and to stand in front of people, the way that you're able to do that is that your body releases adrenaline. And so that's how you're able to do that. Well, what happens with pastors, and I know other jobs too, is that you tend to keep that adrenaline going in your life, because the adrenaline is what sort of keeps you running, and you kind of like it. And sometimes we even create entertaining ways to up the adrenaline in our system so that so we feel better. That's why you ride roller coasters and scream your head off, kicking up the adrenaline. However, our bodies weren't made to live in adrenaline all the time. Do y'all know that? And what Dr. Hart said is that you need to establish a pattern of rest and work, and rest and work to physically be healthy, to give your heart the break that it needs to rest. Now that's from the physical world. That's medically what they say, is that if you push all the time, it's going to do damage on your heart. A few years ago, Dr. Phil, you all know Dr. Phil, right? He wrote the book Family First, and in that book, he talked about the need of downtime for individuals and families to reach their full potential. That without downtime, we miss the mark of effectiveness that could happen in our families' lives. So I'm beginning to see that in the physical world, it's hard on our bodies. In our emotional world, it's hard to continue going all the time. We need rest. And we gather as a spiritual community and we say, well, surely God just says, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, because that's the way we live. And God must be blessing what we're doing, because we're supposed to keep going and keep going and keep going. And however, when we get into the scriptures, we discover these words of rest, that we were created for a pattern of rest and work. Hebrews chapter 4. So in Hebrews, they're talking about the community of faith and what it means now to live a life of faith as Judaism is transforming into Christ followers and what it means. So the writer of Hebrews says, therefore, since the promise of entering God's rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value because they didn't share the faith of those who obeyed. And now we who have believed entered that rest. And then he refers back to the Hebrew scriptures, just as God said, I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. So in the Old Testament, there's part where in anger or in struggling with God's people, then they don't get the rest. But, God loves us and didn't stay in that place. And yet, God's work has been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day, God rested from all of his works. And again in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. And it continues. Now be careful, because in the middle here, you like me might go, what's going on? Let's just all stay together, keep our brains focused a little longer. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter the rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as the passage quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would have not spoken later about another day. Verse 9. If I lost you, come back. Are you ready? There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also enters rest from their work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. There remains for God's people a day of rest. Is that good news? Some of you are like, that ain't going to happen. But let's look at it. Let's see what it is that God is trying to encourage us in as we live our life. You know, when I suggest observing the Sabbath, many go to this legalistic place of rules about what you can and can't do. And, I remember those days. You can't shop, you can't mow the grass, you can't appear to do work. Maybe you've never heard of them, but boy, did I grow up with them. And I remember one Sunday several years ago, we were living in a parsonage that was right next to the church. And not thinking about it, on the way out the door, because right there was the drying machine, and I'd thrown in a load of laundry the night before, I threw everything in the dryer, and on the way out the door, I hit the button. Not thinking that it was venting out into the church, churchyard. That was the day I found out that some people felt very passionately about the fact that you don't do laundry on Sunday. And it was passionate. But I'm not talking about legalistic rules about what you can and can't do. There remains for God's people a day of rest. And you may be believing that what I'm talking about is legalistic rules, and you're going to wait at Foodland for me this afternoon and see if I show up and say, aha, you're here. Because some of you have seen me there on Sunday, I know. However, what I think we're talking about is more than rules. The Sabbath isn't about rules. The Sabbath is about relationship. Our relationship with God and how it is that we live our life in a rhythm that God has created us to be. And so the challenge is, how can we hear about Sabbath without thinking about the rules that we've been ingrained with? How can we hear Sabbath and hear the word relationship? Because God invites us to relationship. Brad mentioned that the boys, along with him, it was the God and family who did the 10 Commandments, right? And they had these hand signals for how to remember all the 10 Commandments. And I tried to memorize them, but the signals got to me. But Ryan, I'm not going to make you do them for everybody. So I put them up on the screen so we'd all be reminded together. The first 3 commandments, I think that's next, talks about our relationship with God. And I took this from Exodus chapter 20. And basically it talks about how do we live in covenant relationship with our God, that we don't have any other gods before us, we don't make ourselves of an image in the form of anything in place of God, and we don't misuse the name of the Lord our God in vain. Those are the first 3 of the commandments, talks about our relationship with God. Next we have our relationship with family, Exodus chapter 20. Honor your father and your mother. This is commandment number 5. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. So we have the first 3, which deal with our relationship with God. Then we have number 5, our relationship with family. And then we have 6 through 10. How do we relate with one another? Well, first thing is we don't kill each other. That's a bad thing. You shouldn't murder, commit adultery, steal, give false testimony, covet. So the commandments are structured in a way that we have our relationship with God, then we have our relationship with family, and our relationship with one another. But it's number 4 that's right there. That's kind of the bridge between how do we balance all of this stuff? How do we balance all of these relationships? It's the one we tend to jump over the quickest. Number 4. This deals, next slide. Keeping the balance. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Now that generally when we're listing the commandments, that's what we remember. Right, Brad? You didn't have him remember all those other verses, right? No. 6 days ye shall labor, do all your work. 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it ye shall not do any work, neither you, your son, nor daughter, male or female servant, your animals, any foreigner residing in your town. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and what is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You know, there's a lot of explanation with number 4. I think it's important. And this is the reason I think it's important, because we've been invited to this relationship with God and how to keep God holy in our life. We've been invited in this relationship with our family and with all those we live in community with, and that bridge between the two of how we keep it all in balance. How do we keep our focus? How do we keep our focus on God? How do we keep our focus in relationship is because we don't run ourselves into the ground. But every now and again, and the recommendations every 7th day is you take a breath. And you remember that God's the greatest priority in your life, and you deal with how God is inviting you to be in relationship with others. And so it becomes that bridge, and when we jump over that, we're missing how important that is. You see, the commandments, I believe, are meant to be healthy guidelines in our life for how to be in relationship with God. And when we look at them legalistically, we just simply miss the point. Life can be lived to the fullest when we structure our life with these guidelines. But I remember growing up, the commandments weren't talked about as a relationship tool, but they were talked about as rules. The 4th commandment was about what you couldn't do on Sunday. Now, you'll know what I was often accused of by what I remember, what my family was accused of. Don't work in the yard. Boy, my mom would get it from the neighbor when she'd go out and trim. Glory, hallelujah. Don't shop. Shoot, stores weren't even open. Raise your hand if you remember that with me. Stores weren't open on Sunday. Okay. We'd go roller skate in the parking lot. Don't hunt. That was a big day that we could go walking in the woods because we weren't afraid about anybody else shooting anything. And don't appear to do any work. A lot of that's changed. Sunday looks like every other day now. Other things are open on Sunday. It's no longer different. Society has said it's no longer different, but that doesn't mean we have to go along with it, right? No, society no longer has an external control of a day of rest. We decided the rules weren't regulatory, and somewhere along the line we defined the day of rest as not the day we do our pay job. It's the day when we do the laundry, do everything else, go to the grocery store, get it all done, and then we barely take a breath before we start our work week again, right? We threw the baby out with the bathwater. Good glory. There it went. And then we wonder why we're so tired, why we're emotionally depleted, why we're spiritually empty. We were created with this internal rhythm of how to live life, and we totally deny that, and then we blame God for it. Well, God, why do I feel so lousy? Maybe God's saying, because you've forgotten the rhythm in which you were created. Now remember, I'm preaching to myself this morning, and you all get to listen in. I'm overwhelmed by the number who talk about something missing, spiritually tired, worn out, don't have time to refuel. Part of the problem is, and we hate to admit it, is there remained for God's people a Sabbath rest. That Sabbath is that balance between relationship with God and relationship with one another. There was a man who challenged his neighbor to an all-day wood cutting contest. They had contests over everything, and they decided to see who could chop the most wood in one day. So they begin early in the morning. They're chopping wood like crazy, and they're stacking it up. And the one guy's thinking, "Wow, I'm really doing well," because every time he looked over, his neighbor was sitting on a stump. He thought, "Wow, look at him, and I'm just going and going and going and going, and I'm doing so good." And they get at the end of the day, and they look at their 2 stacks, and lo and behold, the guy kept sitting on the stump while he had more wood than the other fella. And that guy said, "Now, wait a second, that isn't fair, because every time I looked over there, you were sitting on the stump." And the man looked at him and smiled, and he said, "Yeah, but every time I was sitting, I was sharpening my saw." The day of rest is meant to be a time that we sharpen our saw, that we can get more work done in 6 days if we live in a rhythm of rest than if we just keep going and going and going and going and going. How many days can you go in a row before you stop? I'm about 26, to be honest. Then that 27th day, my body either decides we're going to have a cold, so she can't get out of bed, or I'm forced to rest that day because I'm so tired. God didn't create me that way. God didn't create you that way. It's about this pattern of how we live. For the Christian soul, Sabbath time is a time to sharpen our axe. We were created for Sabbath rest. In Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus said, and there was a little bit more before this if you want to look at all of what he said, but he says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us because it's how we were created. And it's not for us to have to do so much work on. In our foundational story of creation and the explanation as to why it's in the Ten Commandments, God worked 6 days and rested on the seventh. You know, when we live our lives contrary to that, we're saying, in effect, well, God, you may need to rest, but I sure don't, because I'm better than you. Now, you may say, oh, I would never say that to God. But if we live our life and we keep going and we keep going and we keep going and we keep going and we think we're too good for rest because we live in a culture that doesn't value that at all. We live in a culture that values work, and only those who work really hard are the ones who get the reward, and so we don't value that. We are, in essence, placing ourselves above God and our Creator. Now, you can do that, and you can do that for a long period of time, but at some point, something is going to rebel. Whether it's your physical body, your emotional self, or your spiritual self, something will eventually rebel. Often through the Gospels, you find Jesus separating himself to rest and to pray. And there's time when Jesus told his weary disciples to get some rest, especially after a prolonged period of ministry. And in the Old Testament, God set the pattern for us when he rested from all God's work. So the question I'm struggling with, and the question I invite you to struggle with me on, is should we take the example of God seriously? Should we really structure our lives in such a way that we give ourselves a time of rest, that we honor the work that God has invited us to do by taking one day to rest and to think about God and to refocus our priorities and to resharpen ourselves as we enter into another day? You know, we have plans, though. Lots of plans, unending plans, ceaseless activity, frantic getting. We got so many things to do. But then, you know, if you hang out with folks for very long, and we may have spiritual talk here, so we might not do it as much, but did you ever notice how often people say they're tired? They're just weary from all the running. There's so much hurry. Such long to-do list. Our schedules are crazy. We're too busy. We're so tired. You know, and God has that question for us. Friend, how long are you going to stay on the treadmill? I know yesterday at Mary Lee's shower, I was talking with Megan, and I said to Megan, there was a few Saturday nights ago that I ran to Walmart to do our grocery shopping, and I was walking through Walmart with all the other moms who looked as tired as I felt, and as we're walking through there, I thought, you know, growing up, I really didn't think this was my life. Going to Walmart on Saturday night to do grocery shopping. But it is life. We huff and puff and we try to outrun the machine, and we hope the pace will slow all on its own, and we'll simplify our lives when the things around us get better. But folks, our life around us isn't going to magically get better. We need to step up. We need to step up. And even though the world around us says go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there remains for God's people a day of rest. It's scriptural. The seventh, there was a day of rest. Let the rhythm of work and rest rule your life. Sabbath is a time to disconnect from your ordinary life and to remember that there is a God and we're not God. And I always say after that, thank God. Thank you that I don't have to be the one who figures all of this out. Thank you that you're there and that I'm not alone. So I want to share some ideas that I've been struggling with and looking through, and for what it means and what it takes to create a Sabbath time. Number one, don't work. And I'm not going to define for you what that means. It's fundamental, derived directly from the commandment. The Jewish system involved an endlessly complex set of rules about what constitutes forbidden work. I'm not going to follow you around and say, if you take 37 steps away from your house, you're out. No, it's not about that. But what does it mean to work? There's a line in Peter Pan that says, work is what you do when you'd rather be doing something else. That's a pretty good definition. That's a pretty good definition because, let's face it, for some, what they consider to be work, for others, it isn't work. Brad mows the grass at our house. There's no secret in that. I tell everyone that Brad mows the grass. Is that a rejuvenating time for you? No, it's not. My brother goes out and mows grass at his house, and he comes in 2 hours later, and he is recharged and on fire, and he's got all kinds of ideas. The man loves to cut grass. I don't understand it. He loves to do it. He likes those little rows. I always want to go out and mess up the rows. Isn't that awful? But, I want to. But no, he absolutely enjoys it. And we were struggling with a decision about my dad. He said, I'm going to go mow grass. And I thought, what? At the end of that, he had it all figured out. I should have let him do it earlier. It was very restful for him in a weird kind of way. I love my brother. I don't know if that's work. The neighbors would probably say he's working. I don't know. He is rejuvenated. There's nothing else he can think about. He can talk to God in the midst of it. It's a good thing. I'm not going to say if that's work or not, but work is what you do when you would rather be doing something else. And I'm not going to talk about legalistic rules. It's not about rules. What's it about? Do you remember? It's about relationship. What connects you with God? Another way to look at this is to think relationally. Think about going on a date. Remember when we used to do that? Remember, honey? You go on a date, you get all ready, come picks you up at the door, and you say, what are we going to do tonight? And you smile and say, bills. We're going to pay all the bills tonight. You think, what? We're going to mop the floor. We're going to clean the house. What would you do on a date to get to know somebody better, to spend time with them? Maybe that will help you sort out what is it that I need to do or not do on this day. Next, don't rely on technology to keep you distracted. Disconnect. Disconnect. When the telephone was first introduced, a friend told Oscar Wilde it was just the thing for a man with so many friends. He said, how does it work? The man says, well, one of your friends wants to talk to you. A little bell rings. You run down the hall and you pick it up and say hello. Oscar Wilde looked at him and said, you mean I'm like a servant? Because, when they need a servant, they ring a little bell. Have you ever felt like a servant to the little ringing contraption? Well, when Rachel was younger, we taught her this. We came up with rhymes so that she could remember Brad and I's telephone number. And mine was that calls my mom and she says, Whippy, because it's Rachel. So one day we were going through it and I said, and Rachel said, she was only about 4 at the time, she said, that calls my mom, and she says, oh no, not the phone again. And it was true. Do you ever feel like a slave to the conveniences around us? We really love them, but maybe take a day and disconnect. I know you're all in panic, aren't you? Disconnect from the computer, from your phone, your Kindle Fires, even though you really, really love them. Maybe take a day to step away. And what would it mean for your life to live in a different rhythm? Next, and I'm really cautious about this, but I keep coming back to it in all my studies, and that's shopping. Some of you are going to throw things at me right now. And maybe it's just me and my personality. Because when there's a big sale going on and I'm walking into a store and people are pushing and shoving and carrying on, I don't think about the wonder and majesty of God in that moment. It's not very restful for me. I want to get there before they get what I want. It's just, I'm not feeling very connected. Now, there are times that I've shopped with family and it's been a wonderful time of connection, but that's very few and far between. So please, if you see me at Foodland later, do not yell at me because I'm at the store. We're working on this together, right? But it's that shopping, that doing of chores, the trying to get things done. If it's a distraction. Did you know that currently shopping is now the #1 leisure time activity in America? I thought, wow, I didn't know that. It's what we do to have fun. But it distracts us and it disconnects us from people and from the world around us. We spend a huge amount of time there. So you may want to consider that. Now, if we have don'ts and all of these things that we take out, we may think, okay, if I take out the don'ts, then I'm doing good. Well, no, because really Sabbath is about doing. It's not about don'ting. There's some things that you do to experience Sabbath rest. So these are some things to do: to pray, to worship, spend time with God. You know, we should make time for devotions every day. I'm realistic. I know that doesn't happen for everyone. But what if one day a week you say, God, I have an appointment with you. I have a date with you. It's the first thing I'm going to do on the first day of the week, and that's today. That's on Sunday. And I'm going to spend that time with you, God, and we're going to look through everything together. And I'm going to commit this time to you. Take one day a week to set aside for God. Now, I'm not saying, for 12 hours, sit on a hard bench, the little house on the prairie, kind of suffering through the day in worship. It's not what I'm talking about. But about really opening yourselves up to the possibility of what's God saying to me today. So that after the benediction, you don't just leave this go. After the benediction, maybe God's saying, hey, you are doing a good job with this rhythm of work and rest. Let's keep it up. That may be what God speaks to you this afternoon. Or maybe, like me, God's going to say, okay, Steph, now that you preached about, what you going to do about it? Now that we've heard these words, are we just going to ignore it? Are we going to ignore what it does to our bodies and our emotions and our spiritual health? Are we going to keep on the treadmill? Then maybe God's saying, if you're going to ignore it, then don't blame me for the treadmill. Those words of caution in our life. So do spend times of focusing on God. Do spend time with family and friends. We have a huge emphasis on quality time, but I'm going to emphasize also quantity time enough to really relax and have a conversation. Have you ever noticed the best conversations are at the end of your visit? It's because you needed time to work your way up to that. The best conversations are always held to the last. If you don't have that time, you don't always get there. One of the most deeply rooted Jewish Sabbath tradition is a Friday evening meal, a time for the best china, best food, and the best of everything in meaningful conversation. We've missed that. I miss greatly Sunday afternoons the way they were when I was growing up, because my grandparents would visit. And one would come and visit our house, and we'd spend time with them, and then we'd go visit the other grandparents. And we'd play games, and if it was nice outside, we'd play games outside, and I learned so much about my family in that time. And in these days, we're all scattered and disconnected, and we don't have that. And I really miss that time of being in community with my family. So these are some thoughts that I've had of what things that we need to do. And I can't cover everything today, because then it would be a 12-hour Little House on the Prairie kind of experience. Because believe it or not, God has a lot to say about Sabbath, but I bet Brad and I are going to revisit this. Okay, actually, I know that Brad and I are going to revisit this as we live our life in rhythm together. Folks get caught up on things, and there may be some stuff that you want to talk about, and we'll talk about it later, and I'm not just ignoring it. Sometimes we get caught up in, is Sabbath Saturday or is Sabbath Sunday? Christians gather on Sunday because that's the day of resurrection, the first day of the week, and then we think, since it's not Saturday anymore, then I just don't have to do anything. Don't get yourself off the hook that fast, because your body's still created for this time of rest. I'm willing to talk about that, and we'll look at that in future times. What happens if I have to work on those days? People work. There are folks in the hospital right now. They need doctors and nurses and technicians who are going to care for them and make sure that they have everything. People are going to work on Sunday. So if I work on Sunday, does that mean I don't ever get a Sabbath rest? Well, I really hope not, because I work every Sunday of my life. But how can I create a rhythm of rest? How can I create that for myself and for my family to live in that rhythm? We can do that. So it means I have to be more intentional, because there's not a time to worship on that day that's apart from Sunday. So how do I connect with God? And reading the scriptures, and for me and for Brad, being out in nature and experiencing God in nature and reading the Psalms and having a time to focus. There's some things we have to do. It makes it a little harder, but it can work. Sabbath, it can be a bright and joyful time or solemn and contemplative. The key is making it a time apart from the ordinary and prayerful in every case. To honor our work, we take a day of rest. To honor God by listening to the rhythm that's created in us. As I close, I invite you to hear these words from Isaiah. This is from 58, beginning chapter 58, beginning in verse 13. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way, not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. How many of you are looking for more joy? Okay, a few hands. We're looking for more joy. God says, if you live in this rhythm of work and know that you can take rest without guilt, and live in a rhythm of work and know that you can take rest without guilt because it's the way you were created, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And God said, I will cause you to ride on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. So today, I offer you these reflections on the Word of God for the people of God as we seek to figure out together what does it mean in our life today, in this culture, in our generation, that there remains for God's people a Sabbath rest. Let us pray. Oh God, we open ourselves up to your possibilities on this day. And I'm excited that we get to join together in a meal after Sunday school today. A time to fellowship, to work on relationships around us, to enjoy the people that you've put us in community with. And wherever we are, God, throughout this week, help us to really look at our calendar, to begin this rhythm of work and rest. To know that it's the hard work of taking time off to live in that rhythm, and that it won't come easy, but the rewards will be your joy. We embrace the joy that you offer us, God. In Jesus'